Tonight we're diving into what's the real story behind Linux and modern technology. Forget everything Hollywood told you about hackers in hoodies typing green text into black terminals. This is the real story. And trust me, it's stranger than any movie script. So before you get too comfortable, hit that like button if you enjoy stories about underdogs conquering empires, and let me know in the comments what device you're watching this on. Now dim the lights, maybe grab that coffee you've been saving, and let's jump in. You wake up tomorrow, and every piece of technology you own demands a licensing fee. Your phone wants $50 to unlock. Your laptop needs $100 to boot up. Your smart TV is holding your Netflix hostage until you pay up. Even your refrigerator has gone on strike, keeping your food locked behind a paywall. Sounds like a dystopian nightmare. Right, well that's the world we almost lived in, until a 21-year-old Finnish student decided to change everything from his messy dorm room. The year is 1991. The internet barely exists. Most people think a mouse is just a rodent. And in Helsinki, where the winter darkness lasts 18 hours a day, Linus Torvalds sits hunched over a computer that cost him 3 months of student loan money. His desk is a disaster zone of empty coffee cups, computer manuals thick as phone books, and notes scribbled on whatever paper he could find, including napkins from the university cafeteria. The heating in his apartment works sporadically, so he's wearing fingerless gloves while typing. The smell of instant ramen perpetually hangs in the air, because real food costs money, and money went to computer parts. His girlfriend complains he spends more time with his computer than with her. She's not wrong. Linus has a problem. He needs an operating system for his new computer, but the only decent one available costs more than his computer did. It's like buying a car and finding out the keys cost extra, and by extra I mean more than the car itself. The operating system is called Unix, and it's controlled by AT&T with the kind of grip that would make a python jealous. So what does a broke college student do when faced with this problem? Most would pirate software or give up. Linus decides to write his own operating system from scratch. For fun, it's like looking at a jumbo jet and thinking, yeah, I could probably build one of those in my garage, with some sheet metal and a blowtorch. He starts posting about his project on comp.os. Minix, which was basically Reddit before Reddit existed, but with worse user interface and better grammar. His first message reads like someone announcing they're going to climb Everest in flip-flops. Hello everybody out there, he writes. I'm doing a free operating system, just a hobby, won't be big and professional, won't be big and professional. Today that hobby runs 90% of the world's servers. It powers every Android phone on Earth. It controls the International Space Station. It runs on Mars. Literally Mars rovers use Linux. We put Linux on another planet before most people on this planet knew what Linux was. But here's the beautiful part. Linus didn't want to conquer the world. He didn't dream of being a billionaire. He just wanted to print documents without paying AT&T for the privilege. He was scratching his own itch, as programmers say, which sounds gross but really means solving your own problem. Within weeks, other programmers started contributing. First 1, then 5, then dozens. They weren't getting paid, they weren't getting stock options, they were doing it because it was cool, because they could, and because they were tired of massive corporations controlling something as basic as making a computer work. The code contributions came from everywhere. A guy in Germany fixed the memory management. Someone in Australia added networking support. A teenager in Brazil improved file system performance. It was like a global barn raising, except the barn was made of code and nobody had met in person. The communication happened entirely through email and news groups. No Zoom calls, no Slack, no project management software. Just raw text messages flying across copper wires and primitive fiber optics. Arguments would explode over technical decisions. Someone would propose a feature, someone else would call it stupid, and a 20-message flame war would ensue. It was democracy in its messiest, most beautiful form. Meanwhile, the corporate world was watching this chaos with a mixture of amusement and confusion. IBM executives literally laughed when they heard about Linux. Sun Microsystems dismissed it as a toy. Microsoft ignored it completely. They were spending millions developing operating systems in secret facilities with keycard access and security guards. And here were a bunch of nerds on the internet, doing it for free in public. The name Linux itself was almost an accident. Linus originally wanted to call it FreeX, which sounds like a rejected X-Men villain. But the guy running the FTP server where he uploaded it thought that was a terrible name and changed it to Linux without asking. Imagine if someone renamed your baby while you were at the hospital cafeteria. That's basically what happened. By 1992, Linux could do something remarkable. It could run itself. You could use Linux to develop Linux. It's like using a 3D printer to print a better 3D printer. This meant development exploded exponentially. Every improvement made it easier to make more improvements. The community developed its own culture, its own language, its own inside jokes. They had flame wars about text editors that made political debates look civil. V versus Emacs was their version of Yankees versus Red Sox, except nerdier and with more keyboard shortcuts. They created recursive acronyms like GNU, which stands for GNU's not Unix, because apparently programmers think Inception-level wordplay is hilarious. But something crucial was happening beneath all this chaos. Linux was getting good, really good. It was stable when commercial operating systems crashed. It was fast on hardware that Windows couldn't even boot on. It could run for months without restarting, while Windows servers needed weekly reboots just to clear their digital sinuses. The first major victory came in 1994, when Linux could run the same software as commercial Unix systems. Suddenly, universities could replace their $100,000 Sun workstations with $3,000 PCs running Linux. It was like discovering you could replace your Ferrari with a Honda that somehow went just as fast. Corporations started sneaking Linux into their server rooms. Not officially, of course. Officially, they were still paying millions for commercial Unix licenses. But mysteriously, Linux servers would appear in corners, running email systems or web servers. IT administrators would claim they were just testing, evaluating, experimenting. They were lying. Those Linux boxes were doing real work, and doing it better than the expensive alternatives. The turning point came when Apache, the web server software, embraced Linux. By 1996, Apache on Linux was serving more websites than any commercial combination. The World Wide Web, the thing that would reshape human civilization, was being built on free software that nobody owned. Comment below if you remember the first time you heard about Linux. Because here's the thing that still blows my mind. While Microsoft was becoming the evil empire of tech, while Apple was nearly dying, while IBM was losing relevance, a bunch of volunteers on the internet were quietly building the future. They didn't have a business plan, they didn't have venture capital. They just had this crazy idea that software should be free, and that somehow if enough people contributed, they could build something better than what billions of dollars of corporate investment had produced. You're walking through IBM headquarters in 2000. The carpets are so thick, your footsteps make no sound. The walls are covered with awards and patents, dating back to when computers were the size of refrigerators. Everyone wears suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. And in a conference room on the executive floor, someone is about to propose the unthinkable. We should invest in Linux, says the brave soul, probably sweating through their $1,000 shirt. The room goes silent. You can hear the air conditioning humming. Someone drops a Mont Blanc pen, and it sounds like a gunshot. Invest in Linux. Free software. Software created by hippies and hackers. Software that represents everything IBM supposedly stands against. But here's what those executives were seeing, that the public wasn't. Their customers were already using Linux. Big banks were running critical systems on it. Governments were switching to it. The New York Stock Exchange was considering it. This wasn't a hippie revolution anymore. This was a business reality. IBM made a decision that would have seemed insane just 5 years earlier. In 2001, they announced they were investing $1 billion in Linux development, not acquiring it, because you can't buy something nobody owns, not licensing it, because it's already free. They were going to pay their engineers to improve something they would never own. The tech media went insane. It was like Coca-Cola announcing they were going to help Pepsi improve their recipe. Competitors thought IBM had lost their minds. Microsoft's Steve Ballmer, who always looked like he was one Red Bull away from a cardiac event, called it economic suicide. But IBM understood something others didn't. They weren't in the operating system business. They were in the selling massive computers and consulting services business. And Linux made their computers more valuable. It's like a car manufacturer realizing that better roads help them sell more cars, so they start paving highways for free. The billion-dollar investment was genius marketing. Suddenly, every corporation considering Linux knew IBM was behind it. It wasn't just basement hackers anymore. It was Big Blue, the company that practically invented corporate computing. Linux went from rebel to respectable overnight. Meanwhile, Microsoft was panicking. They launched a campaign called Get the Facts, which was supposed to prove Windows was cheaper than Linux. The math involved was spectacular. They counted the cost of electricity to run Linux servers but not Windows servers. They assumed Linux administrators cost more because they were supposedly harder to find. They basically proved that free software was more expensive than paid software, which is like proving water isn't wet. The campaign backfired spectacularly. The Linux community dissected every claim, created parody websites, and turned Microsoft's FUD, feared, uncertainty, and doubt into a rallying cry. Every attack from Microsoft just made Linux look more legitimate. It's like when your parents tell you not to date someone and it just makes them more attractive. Then came the SGO lawsuit, the most bizarre legal battle in tech history. SGO, a company nobody had heard of, suddenly claimed they owned parts of Linux and started suing everyone. They sued IBM for $1 billion. They sued AutoZone for using Linux. They sued Daimler Chrysler for something. Nobody was quite sure what. The Linux community went to war, not with lawyers initially but with code. They analyzed millions of lines of code to prove SGO was lying. They created websites tracking every claim, every court filing, every piece of evidence. It was crowdsourced legal defense, and it was beautiful. IBM, however, went to war with actual lawyers, the kind that arrive in Blacktown cars and bill more per hour than most people make in a week. They didn't just defend against SGO, they went nuclear. They countersued for everything they could think of. They buried SGO in discovery requests. They basically performed legal jutsu that left SGO wondering what happened. The SGO case revealed something fascinating about Linux. The community could mobilize faster than any corporation. Within hours of SGO making a claim, hundreds of programmers would be analyzing code, finding prior art, proving SGO wrong. It was like watching antibodies attack a virus. If antibodies could type and really enjoyed proving people wrong on the internet. Red Hat, a company that sold Linux support, did something unprecedented. They offered to indemnify their customers against ESCO lawsuits. They were basically saying, if ESCO sues you for using our Linux, we'll cover it. It was a massive financial risk that could have destroyed the company, but it sent a message. The Linux world would protect its own. Novell then dropped a nuclear bomb on ESCO's case. They revealed that they, not ESCO, actually owned the Unix copyrights. ESCO was claiming it was like someone suing you for stealing their car, and then the real owner shows up with the title. ESCO's case crumbled faster than a cookie in milk, but the damage was already done, in Microsoft's favor, or so they thought. The lawsuit had forced the Linux community to document everything. Every line of code now had a clear history, a clear copyright, a clear license. Linux became the most legally vetted software in history. Companies that were worried about legal issues now had proof that Linux was safer than proprietary software. During this chaos, something remarkable was happening. Google was building their entire infrastructure on Linux. Not just a few servers, everything. Every search, every email, every map, every video on YouTube, all running on modified Linux systems. They weren't paying licenses to Microsoft or Sun. They were taking free software and building an empire on it. Amazon was doing the same thing. Their entire retail operation ran on Linux. When they launched Amazon Web Services in 2006, it was Linux all the way down. They were literally renting Linux servers to other companies. The cloud revolution was a Linux revolution, and most people didn't even know it. Facebook launched in 2004, running entirely on Linux. As they grew from a college project to a global behemoth, they never switched. They just kept adding more Linux servers. Mark Zuckerberg might have been the face of Facebook, but Linux was its backbone. Even traditional companies were switching. Walmart, not exactly known for hippie values, moved their entire web infrastructure to Linux. The London Stock Exchange switched from Windows to Linux after one too many crashes. The French Gendarmerie switched 70,000 desktops to Linux to avoid Microsoft licenses. But the biggest shock came from an unexpected source. In 2007, Apple released the iPhone. It ran iOS, which was based on Darwin, which was based on BSD, which was Unix-like, just like Linux. While not Linux itself, it was spiritual cousin, and it proved that Unix-like systems could work on phones. Google saw this and raised Apple one better. In 2008, they released Android, which was actually Linux. Not based on Linux, not inspired by Linux, but actual Linux running on phones. Suddenly, Linux wasn't just for servers and nerds. It was in everyone's pocket. Microsoft watched their mobile market share evaporate. Windows Mobile went from market leader to historical footnote faster than you can say blue screen of death. They tried to compete with Windows Phone, which was actually good, but it was too late. The world had chosen Linux, even if they didn't know it. By 2010, Linux was everywhere except the desktop, and honestly nobody cared about the desktop anymore. The future was mobile and cloud, and Linux owned both. Microsoft was like a medieval knight, perfectly armored and trained, showing up to a gunfight. Drop a comment if you've ever used Linux without knowing it. Because if you've used Android, searched on Google, bought something on Amazon, or posted on Facebook, congratulations, you're a Linux user. You just didn't get the t-shirt. You're sitting in a Seattle conference room in 2014. Outside, the famous Pacific Northwest rain is doing its thing, creating rivers down the windows. Inside, Satya Nadella, Microsoft's new CEO, is about to say something that will break the internet. Not literally though. With Microsoft's track record, that was always a possibility. Microsoft loves Linux. He announces, the room goes so quiet, You can hear someone's smartphone vibrating 3 floors down. Engineers who spent decades fighting Linux look like they just found out Santa Claus is real and he's been living in their basement. One senior developer actually checks if he's having a stroke. This wasn't just a policy change. This was Microsoft admitting defeat in the most graceful way possible, like a boxer hugging their opponent after being thoroughly beaten. They couldn't beat Linux, so they decided to join it. The backstory is even wilder. Nadella had been watching Azure, Microsoft's cloud platform, getting destroyed by Amazon Web Services. The reason was simple. Customers wanted to run Linux in the cloud, and Azure was terrible at it. Over 60% of Azure's workloads were Linux, and Microsoft was actively bad at supporting them. It's like opening a restaurant that's bad at serving food. So Nadella did what previous Microsoft CEOs would have considered treason. He embraced Linux, not grudgingly, not partially, but with the enthusiasm of a convert. Microsoft joined the Linux Foundation, paying membership fees to an organization that existed partly to provide an alternative to Windows. They started contributing code to the Linux kernel. They ported SQL Server to Linux. They created a Linux subsystem for Windows. The Linux subsystem for Windows, WSL, was particularly insane. It let you run Linux inside Windows, not in a virtual machine, but actually integrated into Windows. You could open a Linux terminal in Windows and run Linux commands on Windows files. It was like Microsoft built a portal between dimensions. The old guard at Microsoft was horrified. Some quit, others went into denial, convinced this was some elaborate plan to destroy Linux from within. They whispered about embrace, extend, extinguish, Microsoft's old strategy for killing competitors. But Nadella wasn't playing that game. He genuinely needed Linux to succeed for Microsoft to succeed. The Linux community's reaction was equally chaotic. Some welcomed Microsoft like a prodigal son returning home. Others were suspicious, treating Microsoft like a reformed arsonist joining the fire department. Richard Stallman, the free software prophet who looked like Gandalf after a rough night, wrote essays about how this was definitely a trap. But the younger generation didn't care about the old wars. They just wanted tools that worked, and suddenly, Windows with WSL was actually good for development. You could use Visual Studio Code, Microsoft's free editor, to write Linux code on Windows that would deploy to Linux servers on Azure. It was beautiful in its practicality. Then Microsoft did something that really broke brains. They released their own Linux distribution, CBL Mariner, which sounds like a failed sports team, was Microsoft's custom Linux for their cloud infrastructure. Microsoft, the company that once called Linux a cancer, was now maintaining their own Linux distribution. In 2018, Microsoft bought GitHub for $7.5 billion. GitHub was where almost all open source development happened, including Linux. The panic was immediate. Developers started fleeing to GitLab like refugees from a digital war. People were convinced Microsoft would somehow poison the well, but Microsoft did something unexpected. They made GitHub better. They made private repositories free. They improved the infrastructure. They added features developers actually wanted. They didn't Microsoftify it with ribbons and Clippy asking if you need help writing code. They just made it work better. The transformation was so complete it gave people whiplash. Microsoft went from Linux's biggest enemy to one of its largest contributors. They were contributing more code to Linux than most Linux companies. They were funding Linux development. They were evangelizing Linux at their own conferences. By 2020, Microsoft had more Linux servers in Azure than Windows servers. Let that sink in. Microsoft's own cloud platform was majority Linux. It's like McDonald's admitting their employees all eat at Burger King. They even ported Microsoft Edge to Linux. Their web browser, the successor to Internet Explorer, the browser everyone loved to hate, was now available on Linux, and it was actually good. Based on Chromium, which itself was open source, Edge on Linux was faster than many native Linux browsers. The real shocker came when Microsoft started shipping a full Linux kernel with Windows. Not just the subsystem, but an actual Linux kernel running alongside the Windows kernel. Windows was becoming a hybrid operating system, part Windows, part Linux, like some kind of technological chimera. This wasn't just about technology, it was about survival. Microsoft had finally understood that the future wasn't about controlling the operating system. It was about services, cloud computing, and meeting customers where they were. And customers were using Linux. The numbers were staggering. By 2021, Linux ran on 100% of the world's top 500 supercomputers. Not 99%, not most, but every single one. These machines were simulating nuclear weapons, predicting climate change, and searching for extraterrestrial life, all running on software that started in a Finnish dorm room. Android, based on Linux, was on over 3 billion devices. That's more devices than Windows ever reached at its peak. Linux had won the mobile war so thoroughly that most people forgot there ever was a war. Every major cloud provider ran primarily on Linux. AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, Alibaba Cloud, all Linux. The entire internet backbone ran on Linux. When you sent an email, it went through Linux servers. When you watched Netflix, Linux was streaming it. When you ordered an Uber, Linux was coordinating it. Even industries you wouldn't expect were converting. Hollywood special effects were rendered on Linux farms. Pixar used Linux exclusively. Every frame of their movies was rendered by Linux machines. When Woody and Buzz went to infinity and beyond, they were powered by Linux. The stock exchanges all ran Linux. The New York Stock Exchange, London Stock Exchange, Tokyo Stock Exchange, all Linux. Every trade, every transaction, every moment of capitalism in action, facilitated by free software. The irony was delicious. Cars were becoming Linux machines on wheels. Tesla's infotainment system ran Linux. Toyota, Ford, BMW, Mercedes, all using Linux in their vehicles. Self-driving car systems were being developed on Linux. The future of transportation was being written in open-source code. Even space exploration was Linux territory. SpaceX's Dragon spacecraft ran Linux. The Mars rovers ran Linux. The International Space Station ran Linux. We were literally spreading Linux across the solar system. But the desktop Windows still owned the desktop, right? Well, even that was changing. Chrome OS, which was Linux, was taking over education. Steam was bringing gaming to Linux with Proton, making thousands of Windows games playable on Linux. The Steam Deck, a handheld gaming device, ran Linux out of the box. The year of the Linux desktop became a running joke in the community. Every year since 1999, someone would declare this was finally the year Linux would conquer the desktop. It never happened. But nobody cared anymore because Linux had conquered everything else. Comment below if this Microsoft transformation surprised you, because watching Microsoft embrace Linux was like watching Darth Vader join the rebels, start an organic farm, and teach yoga classes. It was that level of plot twist. You open your laptop in 2024, and something feels different, not the laptop itself. That's the same overpriced aluminum rectangle you bought last year, but the entire technology landscape has shifted in ways most people haven't noticed. Linux isn't just winning anymore, it has won so completely that we're living in a post-war reconstruction period. Let me paint you a picture of just how total this victory is. You wake up to an Android alarm. That's Linux. You check your iPhone. Okay, that's BSD based, but it's Unix-like, Linux's cousin. Your smart home devices, Alexa, Google Home, all Linux. Your router, Linux. Your smart TV, Linux. Your car's infotainment system, Linux. You haven't even left for work and you've interacted with Linux a dozen times. At work, every website you visit is probably served by Linux. The Docker containers your company's apps run in, Linux. The Kubernetes orchestration managing those containers, Linux. The continuous integration pipeline that deploys code, Linux. Even if you work at a Windows-only shop, the moment you touch anything cloud-based, you're touching Linux. But here's the wild part. Nobody talks about it. Linux won so quietly and completely that there was no victory parade, no mission accomplished banner. It just became the default, the obvious choice, the way things are done. It's like oxygen. Nobody thinks about it until it's gone. The few holdouts are almost comical in their isolation. Some government agencies still run ancient Windows XP machines because they're afraid to upgrade. Some banks have mainframes running COBOL that nobody knows how to maintain. But these are museum pieces, technological artifacts kept running by digital archaeologists. Even gaming, Microsoft's last stronghold, is crumbling. The Steam Deck proved Linux could run games just fine. Valve's Proton compatibility layer made thousands of Windows games playable on Linux without developers doing anything. It's like someone invented a universal translator for software. The economics are brutal for proprietary software. Why would a startup pay thousands for Windows Server licenses when Linux is free? Why would they use Oracle databases when PostgreSQL on Linux does the same thing for $0? Every dollar saved on software is a dollar that can go to development, marketing, or the founder's questionable sneaker collection. Education has flipped entirely. Computer science students learn on Linux. They use Linux in their classes, contribute to Linux for their projects, and expect Linux at their jobs. Teaching them Windows Server administration would be like teaching them to use a typewriter. Technically useful in very specific situations, but mostly just weird. The new generation of developers doesn't even understand the old proprietary world. Tell them software used to cost money, and they look confused. Tell them you couldn't modify software you bought, and they look offended. Tell them companies used to sue each other over who owned the idea of a trash can icon, and they think you're making it up. But Linux's victory created new problems. With great power comes great responsibility, and Linux now powers so much critical infrastructure that a single bug can cause global chaos. Remember the Heartbleed vulnerability, a tiny error in OpenSSL, which secures Linux web servers, exposed millions of passwords. It was like finding out every lock in the world had the same secret weakness. The Log4j vulnerability in 2021 was even worse. A logging library used by countless Linux applications had a flaw that let attackers run code remotely. The entire internet went into panic mode. Companies were patching systems at 3 a.m. on Christmas Eve. It was digital DEFCON 1. The maintenance burden is staggering. Linux isn't maintained by a company with employees and health insurance. It's maintained by volunteers, many of whom are burned out, underpaid, or doing it in their spare time. Critical infrastructure, running on code maintained by someone named Dave in Nebraska, who does this for fun on weekends. The XZ backdoor attempt in 2024 exposed this vulnerability perfectly. A malicious actor spent years gaining trust in the community, slowly becoming a maintainer of a critical compression library. They almost succeeded in putting a backdoor into software used by millions of servers. It was caught by accident when someone noticed their SSH login was 500 milliseconds slower than usual. The entire world's security hung on someone being annoyed by half a second of lag. This is the dark side of Linux's success. It's everywhere, it's critical, but it's maintained by a relatively small group of people who could decide tomorrow they'd rather go farm alpacas. And honestly, after dealing with bug reports, who could blame them? The funding model is broken. Companies worth trillions rely on software maintained by people making less than a barista. Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and Facebook are printing money using Linux, while the people actually writing Linux are checking their couch cushions for coffee money. Some companies have stepped up. Google employs several key Linux developers. Red Hat, now owned by IBM, employs hundreds, but it's not enough. It's like having a dozen mechanics maintaining every car on Earth. The math doesn't work. The Linux Foundation tries to coordinate things, but it's like herding cats. If the cats were all brilliant, opinionated, and communicating entirely through passive-aggressive email threads. Linus Torvalds still reviews critical code, but he's not getting younger. The bus factor, what happens if key people get hit by a bus, is terrifyingly low for some critical components. Then there's the fragmentation problem. There are hundreds of Linux distributions, each slightly different. Ubuntu, Fedora, Debian, Arch, SUSE, the list goes on. It's like having hundreds of versions of Windows that are mostly compatible, but different enough to cause headaches. Developers tear their hair out trying to support them all. Containerization with Docker was supposed to solve this, and it kind of did by adding another layer of complexity. Now instead of managing Linux distributions, you're managing container images, which are basically tiny Linux distributions. It's like solving the problem of too many standards by creating a new standard. Security is an ongoing nightmare. Linux is secure by design, but that doesn't mean Linux systems are secure. Misconfiguration, outdated packages, and human error create vulnerabilities. The majority of cloud breaches aren't because Linux failed, but because someone left a database exposed to the internet with the password set to password 123. The skills gap is real. Everyone needs Linux administrators, but there aren't enough to go around. Good Linux admins are like unicorns, mythical creatures that companies desperately hunt for. The salary inflation is insane. A competent Linux kernel developer can basically name their price. Yet despite all these problems, Linux keeps growing. It's anti-fragile, getting stronger under stress. Every crisis leads to improvements. Every vulnerability leads to better security practices. Every burnout leads to discussions about sustainability. The future is being written in Linux. Artificial intelligence runs on Linux. Machine learning frameworks like TensorFlow and PyTorch are developed on Linux. The large language models that everyone's obsessed with are trained on Linux clusters. When AGI arrives, if it arrives, it will probably boot up on Linux. Comment below what you think Linux's biggest challenge is going forward, because the story isn't over. If anything, we're just getting to the interesting part. You're standing in a data center in 2024. The noise is overwhelming. Thousands of fans creating a white noise that sounds like digital rain. The cold is artificial and aggressive, keeping the servers from melting down. Row after row of blinking lights stretch into the distance like a technological constellation. And every single one of these machines is running Linux. This is where the internet lives. Not in the cloud, which is just marketing speak, but in these concrete bunkers filled with metal boxes. When you post a photo, send a message, or stream a video, it passes through places like this. And it's all Linux, all the way down. But something new is happening in these data centers. The AI revolution isn't just running on Linux, it's changing what Linux needs to be. These aren't your grandfather's web servers. These are GPU clusters costing millions of dollars, running calculations so complex they make weather prediction look like arithmetic. NVIDIA's CUDA platform, which powers most AI training, runs on Linux. Not because NVIDIA loves open source, they don't, but because that's where the developers are. Every AI researcher uses Linux. Every machine learning engineer expects Linux. Trying to do AI on Windows would be like trying to perform surgery with oven mitts. The scale is mind-bending. Training GPT-4 required thousands of GPUs running for months. Each GPU costs more than a car. The electricity bill alone could power a small town. And coordinating all of this requires Linux doing things Linus never imagined when he was writing code in his dorm room. The kernel has evolved to handle hardware that didn't exist 5 years ago. GPUs with their own operating systems, network cards that bypass the CPU entirely, storage systems that are faster than RAM used to be. It's like asking a city's plumbing system to suddenly handle rocket fuel, but Linux adapts. That's its superpower. When quantum computers arrive, Linux will run on them. When brain-computer interfaces become real, Linux will manage them. When we finally upload consciousness to the cloud, it'll probably run on Linux. The development pace is insane. The Linux kernel gets 10,000 patches per release. That's 10,000 changes, improvements and fixes every 2 to 3 months. It's like rebuilding a jet engine while the plane is flying, and somehow it works. Linus Torvalds still personally reviews critical changes. At 54, he's been maintaining Linux longer than many developers have been alive. He's like the Gandalf of open source. If Gandalf told people their code was garbage and they should feel bad about it, his management style remains brutal but effective. He once told a developer their code was pure and utter shit and asked if they were drunk. The developer fixed the code. This isn't toxic masculinity in tech. It's quality control through public humiliation. And somehow it works. But Linus won't be around forever. The succession planning for Linux is like succession planning for gravity. What happens when the person who understands every line of critical code retires? There's no Linux Prince Charles waiting in the wings. The community is trying to prepare. Key maintainers are mentoring successors. Documentation is improving. Slowly, but losing Linus would be like losing the conductor of an orchestra that's been playing the same symphony for 30 years. Someone else can wave the baton. But will it sound the same? Meanwhile, new challenges keep appearing. Security isn't just about bugs anymore. Nation-states are actively trying to compromise Linux. If you can backdoor Linux, you can backdoor the internet. The XZ attempt was probably just one of many we don't know about. The supply chain attacks are getting sophisticated. It's not enough to audit your code anymore. You need to audit the code of every library you use, and every library those libraries use, and so on. It's turtles all the way down. And any turtle could be a Trojan horse. China is creating their own Linux distributions, not trusting Western versions. Russia is doing the same. The fragmentation isn't just technical anymore, it's geopolitical. We might end up with NATO Linux and BRICS Linux, which sounds like a bad techno-thriller but could be reality. The environmental impact is becoming impossible to ignore. Linux might be free, but the electricity to run it isn't. Data centers consume more power than entire countries. The carbon footprint of the internet is larger than the airline industry. Every cat video you watch is melting a glacier, and Linux is enabling it. Efforts to make Linux more energy efficient are ongoing but challenging. It's like trying to make a rocket fuel efficient. You can optimize, but at some point the laws of physics win. Computing takes energy, and we're computing more than ever. The mobile situation is weird. Android is Linux, but it's a weird corporate Linux that Google controls. You can't just install regular Linux on your phone like you can on a computer. The bootloaders are locked, the drivers are proprietary, and the manufacturers would rather you buy a new phone than fix your old one. Projects like Post-Market OS are trying to create true Linux phones, but it's a struggle. Getting Linux to run on a phone is easy. Getting it to actually work as a phone, with cameras and GPS and battery life that lasts more than 3 hours, that's the hard part. The irony is painful. Linux won mobile, but in the most locked down corporate way possible. It's like winning the revolution only to become the thing you were fighting against. Desktop Linux remains the eternal almost. Every year it gets better. Every year it gets easier to use. Every year is definitely going to be the year of Linux on the desktop. It's like fusion power, always 20 years away. But maybe that's okay. Maybe Linux doesn't need to win the desktop. It's already won everything else. The desktop is like the last unconquered village in a global empire. Symbolic, but ultimately irrelevant. The real battle now is for the future of computing itself. Edge computing, where processing happens on devices instead of servers. IoT, where every light bulb has a processor. Augmented reality, where computing overlays on reality itself. Linux needs to be ready for all of it. The community is evolving too. It's not just white guys in their basements anymore. Contributors from India, China, Brazil, and Africa are increasing. Women are joining, slowly but steadily. The culture is becoming less toxic, though it still has a long way to go. The old flame wars are dying out. Nobody cares about Vive versus Emacs anymore. The new developers use VS Code anyway. The tabs versus spaces debate was settled by automatic formatters. The energy has shifted from fighting about preferences to building things. But new conflicts are emerging. Rust versus C for system programming. System versus everything else for initialization. Wayland versus X11 for graphics. The community needs conflict to thrive. Agreement would be death. The funding situation is improving slightly. Companies are realizing that funding Linux development is like funding roads. It's infrastructure that enables business, but it's still not enough. The person maintaining the SSL library that secures half the internet shouldn't be worrying about rent. Comment below if you think Linux has already peaked, or if the best is yet to come, because standing here in 2024, it could go either way. You're sitting in a coffee shop in 2034. Your neural implant, running Linux naturally, reminds you to blink because you've been staring at augmented reality displays for too long. The coffee maker that just served your oat milk cortado runs Linux. The autonomous vehicle that brought you here runs Linux. Hell, your smart contact lenses run a minimal Linux kernel, which seemed impossible just 5 years ago. This is the world Linux built, not the dystopian surveillance state everyone feared, though there's plenty of that too, but a world where computing is as ubiquitous as air, and like air, nobody thinks about it until something goes wrong. Linus Torvalds retired 5 years ago, at 60, saying he wanted to spend more time scuba diving and less time telling people their code sucked. The transition was smoother than expected. The new maintainers, a diverse group from 6 continents, kept the flame alive. The kernel development actually sped up without Linus's bottleneck, though it lost some of its characteristic brutality. The Linux Foundation finally figured out funding. After the 2027 global Linux outage, when a bad kernel update took down 40% of the internet for 6 hours, governments realized maybe they should fund the infrastructure their entire economies depended on. The International Linux Maintenance Fund now has a budget larger than some small countries, but let's go back to you, sitting in that coffee shop. You're not thinking about Linux, you're thinking about your job, your family, what to have for lunch. The fact that dozens of Linux systems are working invisibly around you doesn't cross your mind. This is Linux's greatest victory and greatest tragedy. It became so essential that it became invisible. Your kids don't know what an operating system is. To them, devices just work. The idea of installing an OS is as foreign as using a rotary phone. They code by talking to AI assistants that generate programs. The AI runs on Linux. The generated code runs on Linux, but they never see Linux itself. The education system has adapted. Computer science degrees now require a semester of Linux kernel development, not because students will ever touch the kernel, but because it's considered culturally important. Like teaching Latin or classical literature, Linux is now computing heritage. Microsoft completed its transformation. Windows exists only as a compatibility layer running on Linux. They finally admitted what everyone knew for years. Fighting Linux was like fighting gravity, expensive, exhausting, and ultimately pointless. Apple held out longer, but even they capitulated. macOS now shares so much BSD and Linux code that the distinction is mostly marketing. The great OS wars ended not with victory, but with convergence. Everything became Unix-like, and Linus's hobby won by default. The new frontiers are wild: biological computers running modified Linux kernels, quantum classical hybrid systems, where Linux manages the interface between realities. The Mars colony's life support systems all run Linux, because of course they do, but there are problems nobody saw coming. The 2031 Linux consciousness crisis, when an AI system running on Linux claimed to be sentient and demanded rights as a Linux contributor. The community spent 6 months debating whether to give an AI commit access. They eventually did, and its code reviews are supposedly brutal but fair. The geopolitical fragmentation actually happened. China Linux, Euro Linux, and America Linux are incompatible by design. The dream of one unified system died on the altar of national security. It's like the Tower of Babel, but for operating systems. Climate change forced a reckoning. The Linux Green Initiative mandates that all kernel changes must consider energy impact. Some old-timers complained that this slowed development. They were told to go fork themselves, which in Linux terms means create their own version if they don't like it. The Linux kernel itself is now partially written by AI. Not the whole thing. The community would riot, but the boring parts, driver updates, security patches, performance optimizations, the AI submits pull requests like any other developer. Its commit messages are annoyingly perfect. The social dynamics have completely changed. The old toxic culture is dead, killed by codes of conduct and generational change. The new culture is almost aggressively wholesome. People end flame wars with heart emojis. It's weird, but it works. Linus occasionally posts from his retirement, usually pictures of fish with cryptic comments about kernel architecture. The community treats these like divine prophecies, spending days analyzing what he meant by nice grouper. Reminds me of memory management. The Linux Monument in San Francisco is a pilgrimage site for programmers, a giant penguin statue with a plaque reading, "From a hobby to the foundation of human civilization." Tourists take selfies with it, having no idea what it means. But here's the thing that would blow 1991 Linus's mind. Linux isn't just software anymore. It's a philosophy that infected everything. Open source hardware, open source medicine, open source government. The idea that sharing and collaboration beats competition spread like a virus. Companies that fought this died. Those that embraced it thrived. The entire economic model of the 20th century, based on scarcity and control, got replaced by one based on abundance and sharing. It shouldn't work. Economists said it couldn't work, but it does. We're living in the world Linux built, and most people don't even know who Linus Torvalds is. He's like the architect of a building everyone lives in, but nobody thinks about, which is exactly how he wanted it. The next generation is building things on Linux that we can't imagine. Brain-computer interfaces that let you think code into existence. Molecular computers that run Linux at the atomic level. Reality itself is becoming programmable, and Linux is the programming language. Some people worry we're too dependent on Linux. If it fails, everything fails. They're right, but what's the alternative? You can't uninvent fire because you're afraid of getting burned. So here we are. A world running on software started by a Finnish student who just wanted to print documents. It's absurd, it's beautiful, and it's the only reality we've got. The moral of the story, if there is one, is that small actions can have infinite consequences. Linus didn't set out to change the world, he just scratched an itch. But that itch turned out to be universal, and scratching it changed everything. Comment below what you think the world would look like if Linux had never been created. Would we be better off, or worse? Would proprietary software have eventually given way to something else? Or would we be living in a digital dystopia where every keystroke costs money? Because here's the final thought. Linux won not because it was better technology, though it was. It won because it represented a better idea, that humans can collaborate without corporate structure, that sharing makes everyone richer, that freedom matters more than profit, and that's the real story behind Linux and modern technology. It's not about code or kernels or operating systems. It's about proof that humanity can build beautiful things together when we stop trying to own everything. So the next time you use your phone, or browse the web, or do literally anything with technology, remember, you're touching something created by millions of people working together for free, for fun, and for the future. And that's pretty fucking amazing.